Hi guys, I am recording some video feedback on the early draft of your grant proposal project. So I have your proposal early draft pulled up, and I've been spending a little bit of time looking at the planning sheet as well as doing some research myself. And I'll talk about what that research is in a moment. So I'm going to kind of go through the presentation. I'm going to talk about kind of your the CFP and also your client, because those are two major things that you're going to want to be more clear about. It took me a while to kind of look at After School Alliance and kind of understand what they were, but there wasn't a clear CFP that they have. They just seem more like a resource. If there is a CFP that the After School Alliance have, then you didn't provide the right link for that. But what I did, so before I go forth and talk about the actual early draft, I want to talk about your the CFP and your client. So what I ended up having to do is you have a tough subject. You've chosen this idea of after school programs, or at least that was what I was garnering based on the After School Alliance. And anything that has to do with education is going to be tricky because everything usually has to go, funding for education in general is really tricky and quite minimal. And where you find that money and who's allowed to get that money is also tricky. So after doing and I'm going to give you recommendations. It's up to you if you want to take them or if you want to find something else, but you do need to have an actual CFP, and I'll show you one that I found that I think will work, and then I will give you I will also recommend a client for you that would in theory be submitting this grant proposal for grant funding. So after doing some research on grants and after schools, there's not a whole lot of stuff out there that may have been what you found as well. And what kept popping up for me was this 21st Century Community Learning Centers, which is the only federal funding source, and that came up, like I said, almost every time I was doing research. So and that's because it's grant funding from the U.S. Department of Education. So this is what I would recommend your CFP to be from, is the U.S. Department of Education. And I'll provide this link in the email that I also send the link to this video in. And these links here are what gives you information about, who can apply to this grant. And this would give you an idea of who your client should be. So state education agencies, or SEAs, are any education organization that receives money or is allowed to receive money from the federal government. So that includes usually departments of education at the state level. So for example, the Florida Department of Education, I think that's what they're called, but it would be the state of Florida would be, and that's just one example. You could do any state. I was just using it as an example, but you could do like the state of Florida. It would be your client, and you would be writing a grant proposal to the 21st Century Community Learning Centers, which is under the aegis of the U.S. Department of Education, and for a certain amount of money. And then if you click through here, it gives you information about the types of project that they fund, right, which includes before and after school activities, and including over the summer, and it goes through what those are, and those include things that you talk about in your presentation, things like the art and music, math and science. So this does go in line with what you're kind of focusing on in your grant proposal early draft. But so what happens, for example, is in terms of the relationship between the Department of Education and, for example, the Florida the state of Florida Board of Education is Florida would apply for this money, and then they would then dole that money out as mini grants. So then other people would apply to the state of Florida, Florida's Department or Board of Education, one of those two, and ask for money within the state of Florida, and then the state would then dole it out. So it kind of goes, it's like a little bit of a trickle down. But for this one, you would be representing the entire state. I tried to find a smaller one, like where it would be like just within a state, but I was having a hard time finding that, because that's usually done on an individual basis. Like if you're an educator, like, so for example, another grant I found, that I actually found this one through the After School Alliance, is the Ezra Jack Keats mini grants. These focus on, so the public schools, public libraries, and public preschool programs. And these, for example, would be somebody who, it's either a school itself, or a department in a school, or even just one educator within that school would be applying for this particular mini grant. And again, they talk about, who can apply, criteria for school eligibility. So it kind of goes through, and I'm just rereading this really quickly. Yeah, it's basically just the same thing in terms of who can apply and who can't apply. And I'm giving you this because your early draft it's got a good skeleton, but you want to be more specific about who your client is and what the CFP is. So the CFP has to actually be, something like this, where it's got criteria and eligibility. It's in terms of their awards, right? Trying to think. This is a little bit old, but government websites don't always get updated very often. So, but that is, I didn't look through the rest of these. I'd already looked through some of them before, like the Child Care and Development Fund. But this is the one that keeps coming back back again and again in my research that I've been doing. So that's what I would recommend doing. And that would make your life much easier. So like I said, I'll send that link. And I'll also send a link on SEA, state educational agencies, because that would be your prospective client for this grant proposal. One of the other things I want to focus on in your presentation is the use of visuals, because sometimes they weren't always cohesive, and sometimes they were distracting for the reader viewer. The first thing I thought this was a paw print. I know it's not. I know it's like people sitting around a table, but from a quick glance, it keeps looking like a paw print. So I'm expecting this to be, I know it's not about dogs or cats, but I keep expecting it to be about that. So that's just an example of how a visual can mislead or misrepresent what your actual project or writing is about. And for your cover slide for your presentation, and I know this is just the early draft, but I would give a more specific title that's specific to kind of like the thesis statement. And the thesis statement for this is something I'll talk about in just a minute. And then I would just go ahead and give the group names here of each member who would be writing and presenting this grant proposal. Your overview is good because you talk about, you say the purpose of this proposal is to write a grant proposal. So that's a little bit confusing, because you want to think about, and I'm going to use the Department of Education just as an example as I give you feedback on this, because it's just the easiest way for me to do it. But if I were the Department of Education, I would just want, in terms of specifics, and you may even want to consider turning your overview into an introduction, and think about the rhetorical purpose of the slide as an introduction. So, and if it were that, and say, for example, say if you were using the state of Florida as your client who's applying to this Department of Education grant for to bolster after-school programs in Florida, you first also have to identify need. So you would have to provide evidence that, there's so many students who, within a particular age range. Right here, you're focusing on the 8 to 14-year-olds. But you would need evidence to support that there's this number of students in this particular state that don't have anywhere to go after school, or after school programs have been shown, in research, or students who participate in after school programs it has been demonstrated that these students go on to, do not partake in drug use, or do not partake in crime or criminal activities, right? So those are arguments for why after school funding would be needed, right? So there are cultural reasons and also educative reasons why. So maybe depending on what state you use, maybe the after school program is a learning supplement to the actual core curriculum. So the students are in school all day, but maybe they aren't allowed, or maybe for example, the state of Florida, because I have no idea, but maybe, for example, the state of Florida does not, or offers limited funding to public schools for this age group in terms of specific subjects like the arts or certain sciences or whatever, and you want to, or the state of Florida wants to use after school programs as a way to supplement learning for this age group of students with subjects that they don't have the ability to take in the classroom, during the school day. The other thing is maybe there's students who can't afford, for example, an instrument, and an after-school program that's focused on music where instruments are provided would then allow those students to participate in the learning of music and that experience. Or like I said, they could be after-school programs that are recreationally based, where they do, maybe they spend a little bit of time doing homework, maybe they spend some time doing some sports or outdoor activity, or indoor recreational activity. Maybe they do theater, or whatever it is. But the practice of having those students engage in the after school program has some kind of positive cultural impact in terms of the building of these individuals as, positive citizens. So, right, it might be like, there's been an increase, with what we would call a negative correlation, right? So with the diminishing of after school programs in X state, there has been an increase in drug activity or smoking or drinking or whatever among people this age. So you can then make that argument to say, while the decrease in after-school programs are not exclusively indicative of the increase in these negative cultural practices, it is highly probable that because, without these after-school kind of cultural and learning experiences, these students who maybe are bored or don't have anything to do, or maybe they're latchkey kids, or their parents aren't home, or for whatever reason, they're kind of figuring out what to do on their own. So they're just guiding themselves rather than having the community help guide them. So, and what I'm talking about is identifying need. So you have to identify the need. So of your client. So here you talk about, right, at-risk youth, that would provide them with adequate mentoring, social services, support, and prevention programs. So for example, if my client was the state of Florida, I would have to give evidence here, because remember, you need evidence in each element of your grant proposal. I would want to give evidence about what does the landscape of at-risk youth look like in Florida? What are the ages? What makes them at risk? And are there currently after-school programs intact? If so, and or prevention programs. What is their mentor? Are there mentoring programs in place and social services support? If those things are in place in the infrastructure, then why aren't they working? Are you looking to supplement those things? Because you're saying that getting this funding would provide these at-risk youth with adequate mentoring. And adequate feels really like do we want it to be adequate, or do we want it to be better than adequate? I think we want it to be, impactful and meaningful. Adequate is just kind of like, yeah, it's okay. Kind of like a C, right? A C grade is adequate. It's average. That it would provide them with adequate mentoring, social services support, and prevention programs. So you would need to identify the research that demonstrates that there is a problem here, and we're looking to mitigate this problem with the help of this grant funding that would allow us to put certain programs in place that would include this type of mentoring, these types of social services support, and these types of prevention programs that and then here's proof that these things actually work. So then you would need also research that shows that these things are in fact helpful for at-risk youth. And then you would also need to define at-risk youth. So that needs a little bit more explanation there as well. And then you say the purpose, you want to say, is to identify potential. This is too meta, meaning it's too much about the assignment. So I would say that you'd probably just want to get rid of that. And the program will be designed to provide 8 to 14-year-olds with opportunities for success by providing positive role models, academic assistance, social skills, communication skills, and resiliency skills. So the only thing that really needs additional explication here is the program. Again, if your client is the state of Florida, you would want to reconsider how you rhetorically frame that, because then it would become something like, with the opportunities provided by funding from this grant would allow the state to either develop or further develop, because they might already have after-school programs in place that do these things, but maybe they need to pump money into them to make them better. So again, it just depends on what it looks like. But right, so reframing the rhetorical, the rhetorical kind of what is it, the rhetorical, who the client is, right? And what I was saying was how I would frame that as something like, opportunities provided by funding from this grant would allow our state to amplify, bolster, develop after-school programs specific for 8 to 14-year-olds, which is kind of like late elementary to early high school. So it's kind of a weird age range. So you might want to be more specific. There's another place, I think it's in your planning sheet, I think, where you say middle school age. So you may want to stick with that. Or you could just say K through 12. It just depends. But it would allow us to provide these, after school programs, which would, and these after school programs would provide opportunities for success through positive role models, academic assistance, social skills, et cetera, et cetera. And then the rest, I think, is okay. But again, you would just want to reframe this as an introduction, and then focusing it as if you're writing it for your client, right? So, for example, how would the client write this to the Department of Education as an example. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and go on. And just as an example of, like, I think the picture is fine, but one way so that the reader viewer doesn't get distracted or disoriented between the visual and the text is you might put an opacity on this image to make it more see-through, which would then allow the text to come out more. And so just making sure that you have kind of a keen eye for the relationship between the text and the visuals, and so that they're working in harmony together, whereas as the way you have it, they're kind of working against each other. And I know you've got that gray background here so that the person can read the text. Otherwise, it would kind of just be over the picture and it would be really hard to read. But that is, it's just a little bit difficult for the reader to read because there's a lot happening on the slide. So objectives and goals. So here you're talking about the objectives of the grant proposal, and objectives and goals are the same thing. So you can really just use one of those words. You don't need both. But again, you're talking about providing mentorship activities, healthy relationships, build confidence, I think is what you mean, deter children from turning to the streets. Turning to the streets is a colloquialism, so I would put that in quotation marks. Open the site and have the staff required to be able to take care of the children, educate them, inform the community about this affordable after school, and then I'm guessing program is in there somewhere. So again, this is a place where you would want to bring in evidence, because you would want to show how you would want to provide research that demonstrates how mentorship activities, mentorship and activities as they appear in the after-school context do in fact yield positive results for students of a particular age, and that they also yield healthy relationships and build confidence for those students. So that needs research. You also need research for the idea that I already talked about, that after-school programs are a way from deterring children from engaging in what we would consider to be problematic behavior. And then you say open the site and have the staff required to be able to take care of the children and educate them. I'm a little confused if this is one bullet point, just because I can't tell if there's a bullet point here or not, just because of the black outline. But I'm not sure what you mean by open the site and have the staff required to be able to take care of the children and educate them. So that needs some clarity there. But I'm also wondering how that relates to the idea of positive role models. And that, again, is a place where research would be needed. And then, of course, informing the community. And this also you might want to reframe that to think about how the after-school program would be involved in the community. So we talk about community engagement, because you would want, for the most beneficial thing and for the most kind of like what a person like anybody giving out grant funding would want to see is that the community likes the program and the program likes the community. So not only is the after-school program doing something positive for these students, but the program is also doing something positive for the community. So maybe the students would engage in service learning or community engagement. Maybe they would, sometimes schools do like community gardens for after-school programs, which is beneficial to the students because they are doing something collaborative. They're learning about gardening and growing their own food, but then that's also beneficial to the community because then there's a community garden. So that's an example of an after-school program and community engagement. Okay, your next slide. So problem or need. So you're talking about our clients are working parents with a considerable low income that struggle to afford after-school sites for their kids. Kids after school stay on the streets until their parents come from work and are easy targets of crime and delinquency influencers. And there is a need for sites where kids would get extra attention and help with their education after school hours. These programs will benefit parents that are concerned about leaving their, I think that should say leaving their children home alone after school, or leaving them alone after school. So I'm trying to, in my head, figure out the differences between this slide, the rhetorical purpose of this slide, and the rhetorical purpose of this slide, because it seems like this is a continued kind of, what are the objectives of this, getting funding for after school programs, because these would still be benefits, right? These are benefits. So the objectives are benefits, and the benefits and this one here is an extension of the one you already talked about here. You just have to be careful about how you say it, because kids after school stay on the streets. You're rhetorically positing that as a universal truth when in fact it's not. So that's a logical fallacy. So not all students, or not all children who leave school and maybe are latchkey kids, don't just go and then start dealing drugs, right, or taking drugs. That there's a lot of research that works to demonstrate a correlation between that, and in certain communities that's true, but it's not true everywhere. So, but I think what the important thing that you're hitting on here is the objective that the students and the communities are not the only entities who are benefiting from or who would benefit from these after school programs, but the parents would also benefit, and particularly those parents who, maybe they have to work longer hours. Maybe these are one parent households. Maybe these are parents who, like I said, they work longer hours. They would like to be home when their kids are, but they can't. Maybe they are home, but they would like their children to engage in a longer learning process after school. Maybe there's additional things. A lot of kids, tend to do outside of school or extracurricular things. That's not unusual. So, and I myself worked for after school. I worked with elementary school students for many years in after school programs. That was a subsidized program, so it was for it was only for children of parents who had a certain income, and it was beneficial. But then what you don't want, where it gets muddied in these types of situations, is you don't want the after school programs, especially if they are what we call subsidized, which are those programs for students and children who come from low income households, is that the after school program is not looked at as a daycare or some type of child care. And so that is a common misconstruing, and oftentimes on behalf of the parents, that they say, well, I don't, we qualify or are eligible for this after school program because we don't make that much money and I need to work, so you can just stay after school and these people will look after you. And they don't necessarily care about the learning process or any of the extracurricular activities that their child might benefit from. So, and again, I'm not making a universal statement. I'm just saying that is a common conception that people have of after school programs, and that's where after school programs can meet challenges in terms of their benefits, because sometimes people see them as this kind of glorified daycare, or not even glorified, but sometimes just a free daycare where people and sometimes teachers stay after and they essentially just have to keep the kids busy. So that's what you want to avoid in these after school programs. Okay, so then you get to the project plan in terms of what would actually happen. So provide mentoring program, plan weekly activities and instructional programs. So what I would recommend doing here is, I think more information is necessary. Again, this is a place where you want to bring in research, and this is another place where you can bring in research specific to each of the things you have under, because you already talked about these three things, and you already, when you bring them up earlier in the presentation, you'll want to provide research about how these are beneficial and worthy of the grant funding. But now you're getting more specific, right? Now you're saying, okay, the mentoring comes in the form of tutoring and counseling. Is this counseling like psychological counseling or career counseling, depending on your age range? But again, how do tutoring and counseling, how are those beneficial things? And what does the research say about tutoring and counseling and after-school programs in terms of how they benefit students and children those age? Same thing with field trips and field days. These are what we would call experiential activities. And this could also be, if you choose to bring in that community element, that would fall into that. And same thing with instructional programs, right? Dance, martial arts, science, and crafts. How do these kind of additional subjects help benefit and even extend what the students are learning in their regular school day? But how do these things help the students? So bringing in research for all of these areas. And you're going to hear me say that again and again. So I'll try not to beat that with a hammer too hard. I think that's the right saying. Project proposal benefits, talking about partnering with local school districts and juvenile courts. I think this is good. Now I'm trying to think as the client. Excuse me. So if I was the state of Florida, the Board of Education, you could drop, I would say not drop it. I would say this, you would be able to keep this. You would say that instead of partnership, because that would imply that the client is partnering, you would say like facilitate or cultivate partnerships between local school districts and juvenile courts, or juvenile halls, or they used to call them alternative schools a million years ago when I was in high school. I don't know if they still call them that or not. I don't think so, but maybe they do. But, I think that's a great idea. Parents will be at ease knowing that they are able to afford the program and their children are monitored. Youth will have a safe haven to go to after school or remain out of trouble. Again, you want to bring research in there. But I want more information on this because this is really interesting. Is anybody doing this? Is what I would want to know as the Department of Education. I would say, who's doing this? And is it beneficial to partner these public, because I'm guessing you would have to be talking about public school districts. So who's partnering public school districts and these juvenile institutions, or kind of correctional behavioral institutions, and what are the benefits and the drawbacks of that, and what would that look like for this particular grant proposal? And then your second circle rectangle, I don't know what to call it, circle rectangle, youth leadership and growth. So program will enhance youth communication, leadership, and confidence skills, increase high school graduation rate in the district. Good points. You just need research. So how do after-school programs increase graduation rates? We need numbers for that. There's got to be information out there on it. This is a popular area of research, so I think that you shouldn't have problems finding that if you haven't yet. But also, so definitely you need research to help corroborate that, but also this idea here, program will enhance these communication, leadership, and confidence skills. Why is that beneficial, and how? So what will that do for them as citizens? What will it do for them later on, whether it's in high school or college or in the workforce, right? So again, bringing in evidence to support this, and saying more here, because I can infer how these 2 bullet points go here, but the inferences I'm making are not that positive, or not that, I wouldn't say not, they're not positive, but it's more like, because it's more of that universal truth speaking, because it's suggesting that, again, it's rhetorically implying that without after school programs, students just become behaviorally problematic and commit crimes. So you just have to be careful about the way you talk about that. Okay, then you have a timetable. I think the timetable is good, because you talk about, like, I believe this would be for the actual, like, program, like when it's open and when it's closed. Like, I think this is like a before and this is an after, and then this is like actually school. What is needed to go along with this is an explanation of the table. So if I were the Department of Education and I was looking at this, I would say, well, why are you giving me this table? What is it telling me? And what argument am I supposed to take away from it in terms of the benefit of your grant proposal? So that's what's needed there. Because I don't know if you talk about it, the timetable that is missing that you also want to include is the actual time of how long before the Department of Education might see results. So if I were the state of Florida, I might say, like, within the next 10 years. I have no idea. I'm making numbers up. It would just depend on what I would have to do research and then see, like, well, are there already infrastructures in place? Like, are there already after school programs in place that we could put the money into those and make those better? Or are they so scarce that we would have to kind of start new? And depending on that would dictate your timetable for deliverables to the Department of Education. It's easier if there's already infrastructure and support in place for after school programs. Then you already have that expectation there, and maybe you just want to inject money into that as a way to, maybe hire new people, plan new programs, and do things like what you talk about next, which is supplies, materials, and equipment. But you do want to give some indication to, again, if the CFP is from the Department of Education, how long do you anticipate being able to fulfill this program, and then ultimately, what's the goal? Because government wants to see numbers more than anything else, and schools especially want to see numbers. So what would be the ultimate goal then for the state of Florida? If you are the state of Florida and you're saying, okay, and again, I'm going to make stuff up because I don't know, but maybe because it could be a number of things, maybe the use of cigarettes or drugs, recreational drugs, and or drinking or crime or something like that is this percentage within ages 11 through 16. In 10 years, we expect that with the implementation of these after-school programs, that the state of Florida will be able to decrease that percentage by 3%, for example, because that would be an altogether deliverable, is we want to decrease X, right? Or, if you stick with something like high school graduation rates, right? The current high school graduation rate, or the percentage of high school graduation rates in Florida as of 2017 or 18, whatever the most recent year is this percentage. In 10 years, with the, after the implementation and development of these after school programs, the state of Florida expects that the graduation rates percentage will increase from this amount to that amount. that would be a deliverable that you could directly say to the Department of Education, right? Those are the types of deliverables that people are looking for overall, right? It's not just about educating students and giving them community engagement and providing them with experiences and increasing, their learning environment. Those are all things, but you can't just say those things to people who are giving out money. You have to give them those numbers, right? You have to say, we're going to do all this and it's all good, but the end beneficial result of this is that it is going to increase graduation rates. It is going to increase the number of students that move from graduating high school to going to college. It is going to decrease, crime between, youth of these ages. So, because then that has a much larger cultural and political and legal impact than just saying, students won't be on the streets. So that's what these types of people want to hear. All good. Again, just add research to demonstrate, but you're thinking in the right direction here with your supplies, materials, and equipment. Personnel, I'm guessing these are people you want to hire. So you just want to be specific about that, right? So maybe just have like a quick blurb, like, for every after school program, X number of personnel will need to be hired or paid because they might already work at the school, but would need to be hired to oversee the direction of the after school program. And then also thinking about how much these people are going to get paid, because that goes into cost benefits. And that's the same thing with supplies, materials, and equipment. We need to know how much all of this stuff costs, because you would have to itemize that for the Department of Education. How much is an existing building with renovations going to cost? So you're going to renovate the existing building and you're going to construct a new building. How long is it going to take? How much is it going to cost? How much do you have to pay the laborers? Right? So sponsors to provide monetary donations to manage the youth center. I'm not sure that's what you want to say in a grant proposal, because what you're saying is, I'm going to get funding from you, but then I'm also going to get funding from donations from other people. So I would probably change that and talk about the youth center. Is the youth center going to be one of these the new building or a renovated existing building? But you're going to want to change that, because if I saw that and I was the one giving you money, I'd be like, oh, you're just going to get money from wherever, right? To provide resources and supplies, that's really vague. What do you mean? What resources and what supplies, and how much do they cost? And again, for what's the time period you're looking to cover these things for? Are you looking to provide resources and supplies for a year, for 5 years, for 3 years, for 10 years? So you need to be able to demonstrate that. Same things with art supplies and books, desks, chairs, sports, etc. And a lot of these things you can find online, because supplying schools and teachers with the necessary things is an oft talked about topic. So again, I've already kind of talked about personnel. Again, how long are they going to be hired for? How much are they going to be paid? Is it just these 3 people? How many students do you anticipate? I can tell you in the after school program in which I worked, there's probably 3, one director, one like assistant director, and then there were probably, 7 staff members per school, and that was probably for about 50 children. So you want to be able to give a range. So depending on the number of students admitted into these after school programs, because that would be my other question, are you have talked about the at-risk youth and the low income. Is this a subsidized after school program? If so, how many students would be allowed in these after school programs, and that will dictate how many staff members you need to hire. Like maybe you want 1 per every 10, 1 per every 7. So you need to think about that, and then how much they would get paid. And then you have talked about the CPR certified, which I think is great. Background checks is good. One thing that you're missing on here is they usually ask for tuberculosis testing to be done when you're around children, and having a minimum of an associate's in early childhood development, which I also think is good. You might want to open that up to students in college who are majoring in early childhood development. So they can either have an associate's, or maybe they're working toward their bachelor's in it. That's just a way to get additional people that could fulfill this job. And then you have your team names here, which is good. And then your references, which I'm presuming will expand. And I love your special thanks to your future sponsors. I think that's a lot of fun. It gave me a chuckle. Okay, so that's all the feedback I have for you on your early draft of your grant proposal. If you have any questions for me, please let me know. I know my voice is a little raggedy right now, so if you couldn't understand something I was saying, don't hesitate to reach out about that or anything else. Otherwise, I look forward to looking at the final submission of this grant proposal. All right, hope you guys have a great day.